My name was Cecilia Lay, and I am writing this account from beyond the grave through the hands of those who remember my story. If you wonder how the dead can speak, know that some truths are too powerful to be silenced by fire, too important to be buried with bones and ash. What I did on that October night in 1716 was terrible, unforgivable, and absolutely necessary. And if you had lived my life, suffered my losses, endured my humiliations, you would have done the same. I was 22 years old when William Ashford bought me at the Richmond slave market in 1706. I had been torn from my mother's arms, separated from my siblings, and sold alone to this Virginia plantation owner who had heard of my reputation as an exceptional cook. I could prepare elaborate meals, manage complex recipes, and create dishes that would impress even the most refined palates of colonial Virginia's elite. What I did not know, as I stood on that auction block with chains around my ankles, was that Ashford had purchased me for more than my culinary skills. He and his wife Margaret had discovered that owning a talented slave woman provided opportunities for entertainment that went far beyond good food. The Ashford plantation was one of the largest in Virginia, sprawling across thousands of acres of tobacco fields worked by over 200 enslaved souls. The main house was a monument to wealth built on human suffering. 3 stories of imported brick and marble filled with furniture from London and artwork from Paris. It was here that the colonial elite gathered regularly to celebrate their prosperity, to toast their success, to congratulate themselves on their superiority. And it was here that I learned what it meant to be not just enslaved, but utterly dehumanized. Margaret Ashford was a woman of 45 with pale blue eyes and a smile that never reached them. She had been born into wealth, raised to believe that her comfort and entertainment were more important than the dignity of those who served her. She was cruel in the way that only those who have never faced consequences for their cruelty can be. Casually, carelessly, with the confidence of someone who knew that no one would ever hold her accountable. Her favorite game, music, the one that would eventually seal her fate and the fate of 16 men, began during my first month at the plantation. "Cecilia," she said one evening as I was cleaning the kitchen after preparing dinner for her guests, "come into the dining room. I want to show our friends something amusing." I followed her into the grand dining room where 16 men sat around the massive mahogany table, their faces flushed with wine and their voices loud with laughter. These were the most powerful plantation owners in Virginia, men who owned thousands of slaves, who controlled vast fortunes, who shaped the laws and customs of the colony. They looked at me with the casual interest of people examining a new piece of furniture. "Gentlemen," Margaret announced, clapping her hands together, "I want to show you my new pet, Cecilia. Get down on your hands and knees." I stared at her, not understanding what she wanted. "Mom, on your hands and knees," she repeated, her voice taking on the sharp edge that meant punishment would follow disobedience. Like a dog crawl around the table for our guests. The humiliation hit me like a physical blow. These men, these powerful, educated, supposedly civilized men, were watching me with anticipation, waiting to see if I would debase myself for their amusement. I could see it in their eyes, the hunger for entertainment, the pleasure they would take in watching another human being reduced to an animal. I had a choice. I could refuse, maintain my dignity, and face whatever punishment Margaret would devise, or I could submit, preserve my life, and hope that this humiliation would be temporary. I got down on my hands and knees. "That's it," Margaret laughed, clapping her hands. "Now bark, Cecilia. Bark like a good dog." The sound that came from my throat was barely recognizable as human. "Woof," I said, the word tasting like poison in my mouth. The 16 men erupted in laughter. They pointed at me, made jokes about my appearance, placed bets on how long I could maintain the position. One of them threw a piece of bread on the floor and commanded me to eat it without using my hands. I ate the bread. For the next hour, I crawled around that dining room while 16 of the most powerful men in Virginia treated me like a trained animal. They made me bark, made me beg, made me perform tricks for their amusement. And through it all, I memorized their faces. Every laugh, every cruel comment, every moment of pleasure they took in my degradation. I stored it all away in my memory like ammunition for a war I didn't yet know I would fight. This was not a one-time humiliation. It became Margaret's signature entertainment, the thing she was known for throughout Virginia's elite social circles. "Come to dinner at the Ashfords," they would say, "and see Margaret's performing." For 10 years I crawled. For 10 years I barked. For 10 years I ate from bowls on the floor while 16 men laughed and applauded and congratulated Margaret on her clever pet. And for 10 years I planned. The men who participated in my humiliation were not strangers. They were the cream of Virginia society. Plantation owners whose names appeared in newspapers, whose opinions shaped colonial policy, whose wealth and power seemed unassailable. There was Colonel James Whitmore, who owned 5 plantations and 300 slaves. There was Judge Robert Morrison, whose legal decisions had condemned dozens of enslaved people to death. There was Captain Samuel Thornton, who had made his fortune in the slave trade itself, buying and selling human beings like cattle. 16 men in total, plus William and Margaret Ashford. 18 people who had watched me crawl, who had laughed at my degradation, who had treated me as less than human for their entertainment. I learned their names, their faces, their habits. I studied them with the intensity of a general studying enemy positions. I knew which ones drank too much, which ones had weak hearts, which ones were afraid of fire. I knew their schedules, their relationships, their vulnerabilities. But it was not just the humiliation that drove me toward revenge. It was the losses that followed. The way these people systematically destroyed everything I loved while treating it as casual entertainment. In 1714, when I was 30 years old, I had a son named Thomas. He was 12 years old, born from the rape I had endured at the hands of an overseer when I was 20. Despite the circumstances of his conception, I loved Thomas with every fiber of my being. He was intelligent, kind, and possessed a dignity that no amount of slavery could break. He was my hope, my reason for enduring the daily humiliations, my proof that something good could emerge from even the darkest circumstances. William Ashford sold him. I learned about it on a Tuesday morning in March, when I came to the kitchen to begin preparing breakfast, and found Thomas's few possessions packed in a small bundle by the door. When I asked where he was, Margaret laughed. "Oh, didn't William tell you? He sold your boy to a plantation in South Carolina, got $400 for him. Quite a good price for a young buck." I fell to my knees, not in the performative way I had been forced to do so many times, but in genuine collapse. "Please," I begged. "Please don't take my son. I'll do anything. I'll work without rest. You'll do what you've always done," Margaret interrupted. "I will cook our food and entertain our guests. Your boy is gone, Cecilia. He's probably in chains on a wagon heading south right now." That evening, as I served dinner to the same 16 men who had watched me crawl for years, Margaret made me perform my usual degradation. "Our pet seems sad tonight," she announced to her guests. Perhaps someone should throw her a bone to cheer her up. The men laughed, unaware or uncaring that I had just lost my child. They made jokes about my appearance, placed their usual bets on my performance, treated my grief as just another form of entertainment. But something had changed in me that night. As I crawled around that table, as I barked and begged and ate from the floor, I was no longer just enduring humiliation. I was studying my enemies, memorizing their positions, planning their destruction. The final blow came a year later in the winter of 1715 when my daughter Grace died. Grace was 8 years old, born 3 years after Thomas from another rape by another overseer. She was a fragile child prone to illness, but possessed of a spirit that reminded me of my own mother. She would sneak into the kitchen to help me cook, would sing softly while I worked, would tell me stories she had made up to help pass the long hours of labor. When Grace developed pneumonia that winter, I begged William Ashford to call for a doctor. The plantation had a physician who treated the white family and their guests. Surely he could spare a few minutes to examine a sick child. "I'm not spending money on a sickly picken," Ashford told me. "If she dies, you can always have another one." Grace died 3 days later, coughing blood into my arms while I held her and whispered promises I couldn't keep about how everything would be all right. She died because a man who spent hundreds of dollars on wine for a single dinner party wouldn't spend $5 to save a child's life. When I asked permission to bury her properly, to give her a funeral befitting a human being, Ashford refused. "Bury her in the field with the other dead, ma'am," he said. "You have dinner to prepare. We have guests tonight." I buried my daughter in a shallow grave in the slave cemetery, alone in the dark, with nothing but a wooden cross I had carved myself to mark her passing. Then I returned to the kitchen and prepared a feast for the same 16 men who had been entertaining themselves with my humiliation for years. That night, as I served roasted duck and imported wine to men who had more wealth than they could spend in a lifetime, Margaret made me crawl again. "My pet looks particularly pathetic tonight," she announced to her guests. "I think she needs some cheering up." "Bark louder. Cecilia, show our friends how grateful you are for their attention." I barked, I crawled, I ate from a bowl on the floor while 16 men laughed and applauded and congratulated Margaret on her entertaining pet. But as I performed my degradation, as I submitted to their amusement one more time, I was making a decision that would change everything. I was deciding that if I was going to die, and I knew that eventually I would die either from overwork or punishment or simple despair, I would not die alone. I would take them with me, all of them. Every man who had laughed, every person who had participated in my dehumanization, every soul who had treated my suffering as entertainment. That night, after the guests had gone home and the Ashfords had retired to their beds, I sat in my small cabin and began to plan the most elaborate, most patient, most devastating act of revenge in the history of American slavery. I had lost everything: my son, my daughter, my dignity, my hope. But I still had one thing: access. As the cook, I had keys to every room in the house. I knew every door, every window, every hiding place. I understood the routines, the schedules, the habits of everyone who lived and visited there. And I had time, all the time in the world, to plan, to prepare, to ensure that when my moment came, it would be perfect. The 16 men who had laughed at my crawling had no idea that they had just witnessed their last performance. They had no idea that the woman they had treated as an animal was about to prove that even animals, when cornered and tormented beyond endurance, would fight back with a ferocity that would terrify their tormentors. I began planning that very night, and I would spend the next year preparing for a celebration that none of them would survive. The transformation from broken slave to instrument of vengeance did not happen overnight. It took months of careful planning, patient preparation, and the kind of methodical thinking that my tormentors would never have believed possible from someone they considered barely human. But grief and rage, I discovered, could sharpen the mind in ways that comfort and security never could. The plan began to form in the weeks following Grace's death, as I went through the motions of my daily duties, while my mind worked on a problem that seemed impossible. How could one enslaved woman with no weapons, no allies, and no legal rights destroy 16 of the most powerful men in Virginia? The answer lay in the very thing that had made my humiliation possible: their arrogance. These men saw me as property, as entertainment, as something less than human. They paid no attention to my movements, my observations, my growing understanding of their vulnerabilities. They had spent years treating me as invisible, and now that invisibility would become my greatest weapon. I began with reconnaissance, using my position as cook to study every aspect of the Ashford mansion. I memorized the layout of every room, the location of every door and window, the patterns of traffic throughout the house. I learned which floorboards creaked, which locks were weak, which rooms were used regularly, and which were forgotten. Most importantly, I studied the dining room where my humiliations had taken place. It was a large space on the ground floor with tall windows that looked out onto the gardens and heavy wooden doors that could be secured from the outside. The room was designed to impress guests with its grandeur, but I began to see it differently as a trap waiting to be sprung. The first modification I made was subtle enough that no one noticed. During my regular cleaning duties, I discovered that several of the window latches were loose, damaged by years of Virginia's humid climate. Instead of reporting this to William Ashford, I took it upon myself to fix the problem. "Master Ashford," I said one morning as I served his breakfast, "I noticed some of the dining room windows ain't closing proper. Might let in thieves or bad weather. You want me to get them fixed?" Ashford barely looked up from his newspaper. Yes, take care of it. Can't have the house falling apart when we entertain guests." What he didn't know was that my repairs involved installing new hardware that could be secured from the outside with chains and padlocks. To anyone looking from inside the room, the windows appeared normal, but with the right preparation, they could be turned into prison bars. I made similar modifications to the doors, replacing worn locks with new ones that could only be opened from the outside when properly engaged. Again, the changes were subtle enough to escape notice. The doors still opened and closed normally during daily use, but they could be transformed into barriers with just a few simple actions. The most dangerous part of my preparation involved acquiring the materials I would need for the fire itself. I couldn't simply steal large quantities of oil or kindling. Such thefts would be noticed and investigated. Instead, I had to accumulate what I needed slowly, carefully over many months. I began saving small amounts of cooking oil, claiming that containers had been damaged or that I had accidentally spilled their contents. I collected dry wood and kindling under the pretense of maintaining the kitchen fires, storing the excess in hidden locations around the mansion's foundation. I even managed to acquire several lengths of chain, telling the plantation's blacksmith that Margaret had requested them for securing storage areas. Each theft was tiny, insignificant on its own, but together they would provide everything I needed to turn the Ashford mansion into a funeral pie. The psychological preparation was perhaps even more challenging than the physical arrangements. I had to continue performing my daily humiliations, crawling and barking for the entertainment of the 16 men, while maintaining the facade of a broken, submissive slave. I had to smile when Margaret praised my performance, had to thank the guests for their attention, had to act grateful for the scraps of food they threw to me, like I was truly the animal they believed me to be. But inside, I was counting the men who laughed, memorizing their faces, cataloging their cruelties. I was building a case for their destruction, accumulating evidence of their guilt that would justify what I planned to do to them. The hardest part was the waiting. Every day that passed was another day of humiliation, another performance of my degradation, another reminder, music, of everything I had lost. There were moments when I wanted to abandon my careful plans and simply attack them with a kitchen knife, accepting my own death as the price of taking at least one of them with me. But I forced myself to be patient. A kitchen knife might kill one man, maybe two if I was lucky. But my plan, if executed properly, would kill them all. Every man who had laughed, every person who had participated in my dehumanization, every soul who had treated my suffering as entertainment. As the months passed, I refined my strategy, accounting for every possible variable. I studied the guests' drinking habits, learning that they typically consumed enough wine during their dinners to slow their reflexes and cloud their judgment. I observed their social patterns, noting that they always gathered in the same room at the same time for the same ritual of my humiliation. Most importantly, I identified the perfect opportunity, the annual harvest celebration that took place every October when all 16 men would be present for an extended evening of dining, drinking, and entertainment. It was the one night of the year when I could be certain that all of my targets would be in the same place at the same time, trapped by their own arrogance and complacency. As October 1716 approached, I made my final preparations. I tested the window chains to ensure they would hold under pressure. I verified that the door locks would engage properly when activated from the outside. I positioned my stores of oil and kindling in strategic locations around the mansion's foundation, hidden but easily accessible when the time came. I also prepared myself mentally for what I was about to do. I was planning to commit murder, not just the killing of one person in the heat of passion, but the calculated destruction of 17 human beings. The magnitude of what I intended was staggering, even to me. But every time doubt crept into my mind, I thought of Thomas, sold away like livestock and lost to me forever. I thought of Grace, dying in my arms because her life wasn't worth the cost of a doctor's visit. I thought of the thousands of times I had been forced to crawl and bark and eat from the floor while these men laughed and applauded. They had made their choice when they decided to treat me as less than human. Now I would make mine. The invitation for the harvest celebration arrived in early October, exactly as I had anticipated. Margaret was beside herself with excitement, planning an elaborate menu that would showcase my cooking skills while providing the perfect setting for my usual humiliation. "This will be our finest dinner yet," she told me as we planned the evening's festivities. "All of our most important friends will be here, and I want everything to be perfect. The food, the wine, the entertainment, everything must be absolutely perfect." "Yes, ma'am," I replied, my voice steady, despite the storm of emotions raging inside me. "I'll make sure everything is just like you want it." What she didn't know was that I intended to give her exactly what she had asked for, a perfect evening, one that would be remembered forever. Not for its elegance or sophistication, but for its justice. As the date approached, I found myself strangely calm. The rage that had sustained me through months of planning had crystallized into something colder, more focused. I was no longer the broken woman who had buried her daughter in the dark. I was an instrument of retribution, a force of nature that would sweep away everything in its path. On the morning of October 20th, 1716, I woke before dawn and began preparing for the most important day of my life. I cooked with more care and attention than I had ever shown before, creating dishes that would be worthy of a last meal. I wanted my enemies to eat well, to drink deeply, to be satisfied and content when their time came. I wanted them to die happy, never knowing what was coming until it was too late to escape. As the sun set on that October evening, as the guests began arriving at the Ashford mansion for their annual celebration, I made my final preparations. I checked the chains one last time, verified that the door locks were ready, ensured that my stores of oil and kindling were in position. Everything was ready. After 10 years of humiliation, after losing everything I had ever loved, after being treated as less than human by people who considered themselves the pinnacle of civilization, I was finally going to have my revenge. The 16 men who had laughed at my crawling were about to learn what happened when you pushed someone beyond the breaking point. They were about to discover that even the most powerless could find ways to fight back, and that justice, though delayed, would not be denied forever. As I put on my cleanest dress and prepared to serve what would be their final meal, I whispered a prayer to my children, to my ancestors, to whatever gods might be listening. Let this be enough. Let their deaths balance the scales. Let their suffering equal what they have caused. The celebration was about to begin, and I was ready to give them a night they would never forget, because none of them would live to see the dawn. October 20th, 1716 dawned clear and crisp, with the kind of perfect autumn weather that made Virginia's elite feel blessed by Providence itself. As I prepared for what I knew would be the last day of my life, I found myself oddly at peace. The rage that had sustained me through months of planning had settled into something colder and more focused. Not the hot fury of the moment, but the patient, methodical determination of someone who had accepted the price of justice. I began cooking before sunrise, preparing what would be the finest meal I had ever created. Roasted duck with cherry sauce, venison with herbs from the plantation's garden, fresh bread that filled the kitchen with its warm aroma, vegetables prepared in the French style that Margaret so admired. I wanted everything to be perfect, not out of any desire to please my tormentors, but because I wanted their last meal to be worthy of the occasion. As I worked, I thought about Thomas and Grace, imagining them watching me from whatever realm the dead inhabited. I hoped they would understand what I was about to do, that they would forgive me for the violence I was about to unleash in their memory. I was doing this for them, for all the children who had been sold away from their mothers, for all the souls who had died because their lives weren't worth the cost of medicine or care. The guests began arriving at 6 o'clock, their carriages rolling up the circular drive in a procession of wealth and power. I watched from the kitchen window as they disembarked, 16 men whose names were known throughout Virginia, whose decisions shaped the lives of thousands, whose wealth was built on the suffering of people like me. Colonel James Whitmore arrived first, his massive frame barely fitting through the carriage door. He owned 5 plantations and over 300 slaves, and was known for his belief that enslaved people were naturally inferior and required firm discipline to remain productive. He had laughed the loudest during many of my humiliations, often making crude jokes about my appearance and behavior. Judge Robert Morrison came next, a thin man with cold eyes, who had sentenced dozens of enslaved people to death for crimes as minor as theft or attempted escape. He had once told Margaret that watching me crawl was better entertainment than the theater in Williamsburg, and had suggested that other plantation owners should train their slaves to perform similar tricks. Captain Samuel Thornton arrived in a carriage pulled by 4 matching horses, his wealth from the slave trade evident in every detail of his appearance. He wore a coat that cost more than most people earned in a year, and his fingers were heavy with rings purchased with the profits from human misery. He had been present at every one of my humiliations, and had once suggested that Margaret should breed me like a prize animal to produce more entertaining offspring. One by one they all arrived, 16 men who had watched me crawl, who had laughed at my degradation, who had treated my suffering as entertainment. As I watched them enter the house, greeting each other with hearty handshakes and jovial conversation, I felt no hatred, no anger, only a cold certainty that justice was finally at hand. William and Margaret Ashford played the perfect hosts, welcoming their guests with champagne and elaborate compliments. Margaret was particularly animated, excited to show off the dinner I had prepared, and more importantly, to provide her guests with their favorite entertainment. "Gentlemen," I heard her say as they gathered in the parlor for pre-dinner drinks, "I have a special treat for you tonight. Our pet has been practicing some new tricks, and I think you'll find her performance quite amusing." The men laughed and made their usual crude comments, already anticipating the humiliation they would witness. They had no idea that they were about to participate in a very different kind of performance, one that would end not with their laughter, but with their screams. Dinner was served at 7 o'clock in the grand dining room where so many of my humiliations had taken place. I moved through the familiar routine of serving, filling glasses, bringing course after course of the elaborate meal I had prepared. The men ate with gusto, praising the food, and drinking heavily from William's extensive wine cellar. As the evening progressed, their voices grew louder, their laughter more raucous, their movements slower and less coordinated. They were exactly where I needed them to be, relaxed, intoxicated, and completely unaware of the danger that surrounded them. At 9 o'clock, after hours of eating and drinking, Margaret stood and clapped her hands for attention. "Gentlemen," she announced, her voice bright with anticipation, "it's time for our evening's entertainment. Cecilia, come here immediately." I entered the dining room for what I knew would be the last time, carrying myself with the same submissive posture I had maintained for 10 years. The 16 men looked at me with the familiar mixture of amusement and contempt, already savoring the humiliation they were about to witness. "Crawl for our guests, Cecilia," Margaret commanded, pointing to the floor. "Show them what a good pet you are." I looked around the room one final time, memorizing the faces of the men who had tormented me for so long. Colonel Whitmore leaning back in his chair with a satisfied smile. Judge Morrison already chuckling in anticipation. Captain Thornton raising his wine glass in a mock toast to my degradation. 16 men who had never seen me as human, who had treated my suffering as entertainment, who had laughed while my children were sold and died. 16 men who were about to pay the ultimate price for their cruelty. I got down on my hands and knees one last time. "That's it," Margaret laughed, clapping her hands in delight. "Now bark, Cecilia. Bark for our friends," I barked. I crawled around the table, performing the same degrading routine I had endured for 10 years. The men laughed and pointed, made their usual crude jokes, threw scraps of food for me to eat from the floor. They were enjoying themselves immensely, completely absorbed in their entertainment, which was exactly what I needed. As I crawled, I moved slowly toward the dining room door, positioning myself near the exit while maintaining the appearance of performing for their amusement. When I reached the doorway, I did something none of them noticed. I quietly pushed the heavy wooden door until it was nearly closed, leaving just enough space for me to slip through. "Excellent performance, Cecilia," Margaret called out. "Now go fetch more wine from the cellar. Our guests are thirsty." I stood, bowed submissively, and backed out of the room. "Yes, Mom." "Right away, Mom." I stepped through the doorway and pulled the door closed behind me. The sound of laughter and conversation continued from within. The men still discussing my performance and making plans for future entertainments. They had no idea that they would never leave that room alive. I moved quickly but quietly through the house, my heart pounding with a mixture of terror and determination. First, I went to the front door and secured it with the chains I had hidden months earlier, threading them through the handles and locking them with padlocks. Then, I did the same to the back door and to every other exit from the house. Next, I moved to the dining room windows, working from the outside to secure the chains I had installed during my repairs. The metal links slipped through the window frames and locked into place with satisfying clicks, turning what had appeared to be normal windows into prison bars. Inside, the men were still drinking and laughing, completely unaware that they were now trapped. I could hear their voices through the walls, discussing business and politics, and their plans for the coming year, plans they would never have the chance to music implement. Finally, I retrieved the oil and kindling I had hidden around the mansion's foundation over the past months. Working quickly, I poured the oil along the base of the walls, creating a trail of accelerant that would ensure the fire spread rapidly and completely. I piled the dry wood against the walls, building the foundation for an inferno that would consume everything in its path. As I worked, I thought about Thomas, sold away like livestock and lost to me forever. I thought about Grace dying in my arms because her life wasn't worth the cost of a doctor's visit. I thought about every humiliation, every degradation, every moment when these men had treated me as less than human. This was for them. This was for all of us. When everything was in place, I stood back and looked at the mansion that had been my prison for 10 years. Inside, 17 people continued their celebration, unaware that their world was about to end. They had spent the evening laughing at my expense, treating my degradation as entertainment, congratulating themselves on their superiority. Now it was time for the final performance. I lit a torch from the kitchen fire and walked slowly around the perimeter of the house, touching the flame to the oil-soaked kindling. The fire caught immediately, racing along the trails of accelerant and climbing the walls with hungry enthusiasm. Within minutes, the entire foundation of the mansion was ablaze. Inside, the first signs of alarm began to sound. I heard someone shout, "Fire!" followed by the scraping of chairs and the sound of running feet. The men had finally realized their danger, but it was far too late. They ran to the doors only to find them chained shut from the outside. They rushed to the windows only to discover the bars I had installed. They were trapped in a burning building with no way out, no hope of escape, no chance of survival. The panic was immediate and absolute. I could hear them screaming, pounding on the doors, begging for help that would never come. Some of them called my name, finally understanding who was responsible for their predicament. Cecilia. Margaret's voice rose above the others, shrill with terror and disbelief. Cecilia, open the doors, please. I stood in the garden, watching the flames climb higher, listening to the screams of the people who had tormented me for so long. I felt no satisfaction, no joy, only a cold sense of completion. Justice was finally being served. The fire spread quickly through the old wooden structure, fed by the oil I had spread in the dry autumn air. The screams grew louder, then more desperate, then gradually began to fade as smoke and flame claimed their victims one by one. Colonel Whitmore, who had laughed the loudest at my humiliations, died choking on the smoke from his own burning mansion. Judge Morrison, who had sentenced so many enslaved people to death, found himself facing his own execution by fire. Captain Thornton, who had grown rich from human misery, discovered what it felt like to suffer without hope of rescue. One by one they all, music died. 16 men who had thought themselves untouchable, who had believed their wealth and power made them immune to consequences, who had treated other human beings as property and entertainment. The mansion burned for hours, the flames visible for miles across the Virginia countryside. By dawn, nothing remained but smoking ruins and the charred remains of 17 people who had learned too late that even the most powerless could find ways to fight back. As the sun rose on October 21st, 1716, I walked away from the smoldering wreckage of my former prison. I had no plan beyond escape, no destination except away from here. I knew that I would be hunted, that I would probably be caught and executed for what I had done, but I also knew that I had accomplished something unprecedented in the history of American slavery. I had taken revenge not just on my immediate tormentors, but on the entire system that had created and sustained them. I had proven that no amount of wealth or power could protect those who chose cruelty over mercy, oppression over justice. As I disappeared into the Virginia wilderness, I carried with me the satisfaction of knowing that 16 men who had treated me as less than human had died screaming my name, finally understanding that they had underestimated the woman they had tried to break. The fire was out, but the message it sent would burn forever. There are limits to what human beings will endure, and those who cross those limits do so at their own peril. The discovery came at dawn when smoke rising from the Ashford plantation drew the attention of neighboring farms. By the time the first witnesses arrived, the mansion had been reduced to a smoldering shell of blackened brick and twisted metal, the flames having consumed everything within its walls with a thoroughness that spoke of careful planning rather than accident. The scene that greeted the early arrivals was one of such devastation that many would later claim it haunted their dreams for years. 17 bodies burned beyond recognition, lay scattered throughout what had once been the grand dining room. The doors were chained shut from the outside, the windows barred with iron links that had been heated red hot by the flames. It was immediately clear that this was no accident. This was murder on a scale that Virginia had never seen. Word spread across the colony like wildfire, carried by riders who galloped from plantation to plantation with news that would shake the very foundations of Virginia society. 16 of the most powerful men in the colony, along with their host and hostess, had been burned alive in their own home. The implications were staggering. If such prominent figures could be killed so easily, what did that mean for the safety of every other plantation owner? The investigation began immediately, led by the colonial governor himself and a team of magistrates who understood that failure to solve this case could lead to panic throughout the slave-owning population. They examined the scene with meticulous care, documenting the chained doors, the barred windows, music, the evidence of accelerant that had been used to fuel the flames. The conclusion was inescapable. This had been an inside job carried out by someone with intimate knowledge of the mansion's layout and access to its keys and security measures. The list of suspects was short. Only a handful of people had the necessary access and opportunity to carry out such an elaborate plan. It was Margaret Ashford's personal maid, a woman named Sarah, who had survived only because she had been visiting relatives on another plantation that night, who provided the crucial clue. "Miss Cecilia," she told the investigators, her voice shaking with fear and disbelief. She was the cook, had keys to everything, knew every room in the house. She was supposed to serve dinner that night, but nobody's seen her since the fire. The revelation that a slave had been responsible for the massacre sent shockwaves through Virginia's white population. The idea that an enslaved person could plan and execute such a sophisticated attack challenged every assumption about the supposed dility and inferiority of the African population. If one slave could kill 16 masters, what was to stop others from following her example? Governor Alexander Spotswood immediately declared a state of emergency, authorizing the formation of militia units to search for the fugitive and offering a reward of 1,000, an astronomical sum that reflected both the magnitude of the crime and the fear it had inspired. Slave patrols were doubled, curfews were imposed, and suspected sympathizers were arrested and interrogated. But I was already far from the scene of my crime, moving through the Virginia wilderness with the desperate energy of someone who had nothing left to lose. I had no plan beyond escape, no destination except away from the plantation that had been my prison for 10 years. I traveled by night, hiding during the day, living on wild berries and stream water, driven by the knowledge that capture would mean a death far more terrible than anything I had inflicted on my victims. The manhunt that followed was the largest in Virginia's history. Professional slave catchers were brought in from as far away as South Carolina, their bloodhounds trained to follow human scent through the densest forests. Militia units combed the countryside, questioning every free black person, searching every cabin and outbuilding, following every rumor and reported sighting. Native American tribes were offered bounties for my capture, turning even the wilderness against me. Wanted posters bearing my description were distributed throughout the colony and beyond, warning that I was extremely dangerous and should be approached with caution. The reward money attracted bounty hunters from across the eastern seaboard, all eager to claim the fortune that would come with my capture. For 2 weeks I evaded them all. I moved like a ghost through forests I had never seen before, following streams to mask my scent, sleeping in hollow logs and abandoned caves, staying always one step ahead of the search parties that seemed to be everywhere. I had no weapons except a kitchen knife I had taken from the mansion, no supplies except what I could forage, no allies except the darkness that hid my movements. But I also had something my pursuers lacked, the desperate determination of someone who had already lost everything. They were hunting for money and glory. I was running for my life. They could afford to make mistakes. I could not afford even one. The end came on November 3rd, 1716, near a river crossing about 100 miles north of the Ashford Plantation. I had been traveling for 13 days. Music, my body weakened by hunger and exposure, my clothes torn by thorns and branches, my feet bleeding from walking over rough terrain without proper shoes. I was trying to cross the river when the slave catchers found me. Their dogs had picked up my scent despite my efforts to mask it, and they had been following me for hours, closing the distance with the patient persistence of professional hunters. "That's her," one of them shouted as I stumbled into the shallow water. "That's the one who burned them all." I could have tried to run, could have attempted to lose myself in the forest on the far side of the river, but I was exhausted, starving, and sick with fever from drinking contaminated water. More importantly, I was tired of running. I had accomplished what I set out to do. 16 men who had treated me as less than human were dead, their cruelty repaid with interest. I turned to face my captives, standing knee-deep in the cold river water, and waited for them to reach me. "You're Cecilia?" the lead hunter asked, his hand resting on the pistol at his side. "The one who killed all them gentlemen?" "Yes," I said, my voice from days without speaking. "I'm Cecilia. I killed them all." The admission seemed to shock them. Even though they had been hunting me for weeks, they had expected denials, pleas for mercy, claims of innocence. They had not expected this calm acknowledgement of guilt, this complete absence of remorse or fear. "Why?" one of them asked. "Why did you do it?" I looked at him, a young man, probably not much older than my son Thomas would have been, and tried to find words that could explain 10 years of humiliation, the loss of my children, the systematic destruction of everything I had ever loved. "Because they treated me like an animal," I said finally. "For 10 years they made me crawl and bark and eat from the floor while they laughed. They sold my son like livestock. They let my daughter die because her life wasn't worth the cost of medicine. They took everything from me, so I took everything from them." The hunters exchanged glances, unsure how to respond to such honesty. They had been expecting to capture a monster, but they had found something more disturbing, a human being who had been pushed beyond the breaking point and had responded with calculated vengeance. They chained me hand and foot for the journey back to Williamsburg, where I would face trial for the most notorious crime in Virginia's history. As we traveled, word of my capture spread ahead of us, drawing crowds of curious onlookers who wanted to see the slave woman who had burned 16 masters alive. Some came to gawk at me like I was a circus attraction, pointing and whispering about the monster who had committed such terrible crimes. Others, particularly the enslaved people who lined the roads as we passed, looked at me with expressions I couldn't quite read. Fear, certainly, but also something that might have been admiration or respect. I had done something that no slave in Virginia had ever done before. I had struck back at the system that oppressed us all, had proven that even the most powerless could find ways to fight back when pushed beyond endurance. The message was not lost on those who watched me pass in chains. By the time we reached Williamsburg, my story had grown in the telling. Some said I had used witchcraft to trap my victims. Others claimed I had been possessed by demons. A few suggested that I was part of a larger conspiracy, that other slaves throughout the colony were planning similar attacks. The truth was both simpler and more terrifying than any of these theories. I was not a witch or a demon or a revolutionary leader. I was just a woman who had been treated as less than human for so long that I had finally decided to respond in kind. As I was led through the streets of the colonial capital, past the governor's palace and the college where Virginia's elite sent their sons to be educated, I thought about the 16 men who had died in the flames I had set. They had lived their entire lives believing that their wealth and power made them untouchable, that their superiority was ordained by God and nature. They had learned too late that there are limits to what human beings will endure and that those limits once crossed can lead to consequences that no amount of privilege can prevent. The trial that awaited me would be a formality. The outcome was already decided, but it would also be an opportunity to speak truths that Virginia's elite did not want to hear, to force them to confront the reality of what their system of oppression had created. I had nothing left to lose and everything to say. The men who had laughed at my crawling were dead, but their deaths would serve as a warning to others who might be tempted to follow their example. Justice had been served, and now it was time to pay the price. The trial of Cecilia Lay began on November 15, 1716, in the courthouse at Williamsburg, and from the moment I was led into that packed courtroom in chains, I knew that I was witnessing something unprecedented in the history of American slavery. Never before had an enslaved person been charged with crimes of such magnitude, and never before had the colonial authorities been forced to confront the implications of what one determined woman could accomplish when pushed beyond the breaking point. The courthouse was filled to capacity with spectators who had traveled from across Virginia and beyond to witness what many were calling the trial of the century. In the front rows sat the widows and children of my victims, their faces masks of grief and rage as they stared at the woman who had destroyed their families. Behind them were plantation owners and government officials, their expressions reflecting a mixture of fascination and fear as they contemplated the implications of my actions. But it was the presence of enslaved people in the gallery that made this trial truly extraordinary. Hundreds of them had somehow found ways to attend, despite the risks involved in being seen at such an event. They stood in the back of the courtroom and lined the walls, their faces carefully neutral, but their eyes burning with an intensity that made the white spectators visibly uncomfortable. Judge William Byrd II, one of the most prominent jurists in the colony, presided over the proceedings with the gravity befitting such a momentous case. He was a man who had built his fortune on slave labor, who owned hundreds of human beings, who had never questioned the fundamental assumptions of the system that had made him wealthy and powerful. "Cecilia," he said, as I stood before the bench in my chains, "you are charged with the willful murder of 17 persons by means of arson. These are capital crimes of the most serious nature, crimes that strike at the very heart of civilized society. How do you plead?" I looked up at him, this man who had probably never seen me as fully human, who had certainly never imagined that someone like me could be capable of the careful planning and execution that my crimes had required. When I spoke, my voice was clear and steady, carrying to every corner of the packed courtroom. "Guilty," I said. "I killed them all, and I would do it again." A collective gasp went up from the spectators. They had expected denials, pleas for mercy, claims of temporary insanity. They had not expected this calm admission of guilt, this complete absence of remorse or regret. Judge Byrd leaned forward, his face showing genuine surprise. "You confess to these crimes. You admit to murdering 17 innocent people." "Innocent," I laughed, the sound harsh and bitter in the formal atmosphere of the courtroom. "Your Honor, those men were many things, but innocent was not one of them." "Explain yourself," the judge demanded, though I could see in his eyes that he was not sure he wanted to hear what I had to say. And so I told them about 10 years of being forced to crawl on my hands and knees while 16 men laughed and applauded. I told them about being made to bark like a dog, to eat from bowls on the floor, to perform tricks for the entertainment of Virginia's elite. I told them about my son Thomas, sold away like livestock when his master needed money. I told them about my daughter Grace, dying in my arms because her life wasn't worth the cost of a doctor's visit. As I spoke, the courtroom grew quieter and quieter until the only sounds were my voice and the occasional sob from someone in the gallery. Even the widows of my victims seemed shaken by the catalogue of horrors I recited, the systematic dehumanization that had been my daily reality for a decade. For 10 years, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word, those men treated me as less than human. They laughed at my suffering. They profited from my labor. They destroyed my family for their own convenience. They made me into an animal, so I responded as an animal responds when it is cornered and tormented beyond endurance. But murder, Judge Bird began, is what they committed. Music, I interrupted, my chains rattling as I gestured toward the gallery where enslaved people stood watching. Every day in 1,000 different ways, they murdered our spirits, our families, our hopes. They just did it slowly, legally, with the blessing of courts like this one. The judge's face had gone pale, and I could see that my words were having an effect he had not anticipated. This was supposed to be a simple proceeding, a guilty slave confessing to obvious crimes, followed by the inevitable sentence of death. Instead, it had become something far more dangerous, a trial of the entire system of slavery itself. You will be silent, he ordered, but his voice lacked conviction. This court will not tolerate such inflammatory rhetoric. Then don't ask me to explain myself, and I replied calmly. You wanted to know why I killed them. I've told you they created the monster that destroyed them. And they did it with their own cruelty and arrogance. The prosecutor, a young lawyer named Edmund Randolph, who would later become one of Virginia's most prominent political figures, tried to regain control of the proceedings by focusing on the legal facts of the case. He presented evidence of my guilt. The chained doors, the barred windows, the testimony of witnesses who had seen me at the plantation on the night of the fire. But every piece of evidence he presented only reinforced the careful planning and methodical execution that had characterized my crime. I had not acted in passion or madness. I had planned for months, prepared meticulously, and executed my revenge with a precision that spoke of intelligence and determination that no one in that courtroom wanted to acknowledge in a slave. When it came time for me to make my final statement before sentencing, I stood as straight as my chains would allow and looked directly at Judge Bird. Your Honor, I said, I know that you will sentence me to death, and I accept that fate. But I want everyone in this courtroom to understand something. I am not sorry for what I did. Those 16 men and the man and woman who enabled them got exactly what they deserved. You feel no remorse? The judge asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I feel no remorse for defending myself and avenging my children, I replied. I feel no remorse for proving that even slaves can fight back when pushed too far. But I do feel sorry for one thing. What is that? I'm sorry that it took me 10 years to find the courage to do what needed to be done. I'm sorry that I crawled and barked and degraded myself for so long before I remembered that I was human. And I'm sorry that there are thousands more like me, suffering in silence, waiting for someone to show them that resistance is possible. The courtroom erupted in chaos. White spectators shouted in outrage, demanding immediate execution. Enslaved people in the gallery began to murmur among themselves, their voices growing louder despite the obvious danger. Judge Bird pounded his gavel repeatedly, calling for order that was slow to come. When the noise finally subsided, he pronounced the sentence that everyone had expected. Cecilia, you will be taken from this place and burned at the stake as you burned your victims. May God have mercy on your soul. God will judge between us, I replied, and I think he will find that I was more merciful to them than they ever were to me. At least I gave them a quick death. The execution was scheduled for November 22nd, 1716, exactly 1 week after the trial concluded. In the days leading up to my death, I was held in the Williamsburg jail, where I received an unexpected stream of visitors. Some came to gawk at the notorious slave woman who had killed 16 masters. Others came to try to convert me, to convince me to repent and seek forgiveness for my crimes. But the most significant visitors were the enslaved people who somehow found ways to see me despite the heavy security surrounding the jail. They came in small groups, speaking in whispers, asking questions about how I had planned and executed my revenge. They wanted to know if it was really possible for one person to strike such a blow against the system that oppressed them all. It's possible, I told them, but it requires sacrifice. It requires being willing to lose everything, including your life, for the chance to strike back. Most of you have too much to live for to make that choice. And that's not a weakness, that's wisdom. But what if we all chose to fight? One young man asked. What if we all decided to stop accepting what they do to us? Then this whole system would collapse, I replied. But that choice has to come from within each person. I can't make it for you, and you can't make it for others. All I can do is show you that it's possible. On the morning of my execution, I was led from the jail to the public square where a stake had been erected and surrounded by piles of wood and kindling. Hundreds of people had gathered to witness my death, their faces showing a mixture of bloodlust and fascination. Many had traveled for days to see the slave woman who had burned 16 masters meet her own fiery end. As I was tied to the stake, I looked out over the crowd and saw faces that would haunt Virginia's dreams for generations to come. In the front rows were the wealthy and powerful, come to see justice done and order restored. But in the back, pressed against the buildings that surrounded the square, were hundreds of enslaved people who had somehow found ways to attend despite the obvious risks. Their faces told a different story than those of the white spectators. Where the plantation owners showed satisfaction and vindication, the enslaved showed something more complex. Fear, certainly, but also a kind of awed respect for someone who had dared to do what they had only dreamed of. The executioner, a burly man named Thomas Whitfield, who had performed this grim duty for the colony many times before, approached me with a torch in his hand. But before he could light the pea, Judge Bird stepped forward. "Cecilia," he said, his voice carrying across the silent square, "you have one final opportunity to repent, to ask God's forgiveness for your crimes, to show some remorse for the lives you have taken." I looked at him. This man who had sentenced me to death while never questioning the system that had created me. And I spoke my final words with a clarity that would echo through Virginia history for generations to come. "I have nothing to repent," I said, my voice strong enough to reach every person in that crowded square. I defended myself against people who treated me as less than human. I avenged my children who were sold and killed by people who saw them as property. I proved that even slaves can fight back when pushed beyond endurance. I paused, looking out over the sea of faces, white and black, free and enslaved, powerful and powerless, and continued with words that would be remembered long after my ashes had been scattered. "You call me a monster, but I am what you made me. You created me with your cruelty, your arrogance, your belief that some people are worth less than others. You taught me that violence is the only language that power understands, and then you act surprised when I speak it fluently." The crowd had grown completely silent, hanging on every word. Even the executioner had paused, his torch held motionless as he waited for me to finish. "I am not the first slave to kill a master, and I will not be the last. Every time you sell a child away from its mother, every time you work someone to death in your fields, every time you treat a human being as property, you create the possibility of another Cecilia. You should not be surprised by what I did. You should be afraid of what others will do when they decide they have nothing left to lose." Judge Bird's face had gone white, and I could see fear in his eyes as he contemplated the implications of my words. "Light the fire," he ordered, his voice barely audible. But before the executioner could comply, something unprecedented happened. From the back of the crowd, where the enslaved people stood watching, came a sound that started as a low murmur and gradually grew into something more powerful. A humming, then singing. Voices raised in one of the spirituals that sustained our people through their darkest hours. "Swing low, sweet chariot coming for to carry me home." The song spread through the crowd of enslaved spectators, growing stronger and more defiant with each voice that joined in. The white authorities looked around nervously, unsure how to respond to this unexpected display of solidarity. They had come to see a monster executed. Instead, they were witnessing something that looked dangerously like martyrdom. "Silence," Judge Bird shouted, but his voice was lost in the growing chorus of voices. "I order you to be silent." But the singing continued, and I felt tears streaming down my face as I realized that my death would not be the end of my story, but the beginning of something larger. These people, my people, understood what I had tried to do, even if they could not openly approve of my methods. The executioner finally lit the fire, and the flames began to climb toward me with the same hungry enthusiasm they had shown at the Ashford mansion. But even as the smoke began to fill my lungs and the heat grew unbearable, I could still hear the singing, still feel the presence of hundreds of people who saw me not as a monster, but as someone who had dared to fight back. I died as I had lived my final year, defiant, unrepentant, and absolutely certain that I had done the right thing. The pain was terrible but brief, and as consciousness faded, I thought I could hear the voices of Thomas and Grace calling to me from whatever realm awaited beyond this world of suffering. My body was burned to ashes and scattered to prevent any shrine from being erected to my memory. But the authorities could not scatter the story of what I had done, could not prevent the tale of Cecilia Lay from spreading through slave quarters across the South like wildfire. In the years that followed, my name became a whispered legend among enslaved people throughout the colonies. Mothers would tell their children about the woman who had burned 16 masters, who had proven that even the most powerless could find ways to fight back. The story grew in the telling. In some versions, I escaped and lived free in the North. In others, I was rescued by spirits and taken to Africa. But the core message remained constant. There were limits to what human beings would endure, and those who crossed those limits did so at their own peril. The fear my actions inspired among slave owners was immediate and lasting. New laws were passed restricting slaves' access to keys, tools, and fire. Security measures were increased, and the casual cruelty that had characterized relationships between masters and slaves became tempered by a new awareness that even the most submissive servant might be planning revenge. The psychological impact was even more significant than the legal changes. For the first time, Virginia's elite had been forced to confront their own mortality, to acknowledge that their wealth and power could not protect them from the consequences of their cruelty. They had learned that treating people as animals could turn those people into predators, and that lesson would haunt them for generations. But perhaps the most important legacy of my actions was the message they sent to enslaved people throughout the South. Resistance was possible. It might be costly. It might be dangerous. It might require the ultimate sacrifice, but it was possible. The system that oppressed them was not invincible. Music and even the most powerful masters were vulnerable to those they had wronged. Historical records from the period show a marked increase in slave rebellions and escape attempts in the years following my execution. The authorities attributed this to the pernicious example set by my crimes, music, and they were probably right. I had shown that one determined person could strike a devastating blow against the system of oppression, and that example inspired others to find their own ways to resist. The story of Cecilia Lay was largely suppressed in official histories deemed too dangerous to be widely known. But it survived in the oral traditions of African-American communities passed down through generations as a reminder that even in the darkest times, even when all hope seemed lost, there were still ways to fight back. Today, more than 3 centuries after that night of fire in Virginia, my story serves as a testament to the human capacity for resistance in the face of overwhelming oppression. It reminds us that there are limits to what people will endure, that cruelty and dehumanization inevitably create the conditions for their own destruction. I was not a hero in any conventional sense. What I did was terrible, unforgivable by most moral standards. But I was also not a monster, despite what my executioners claimed. I was a human being pushed beyond the breaking point. A mother who had lost everything. A woman who had been treated as less than human for so long that she finally decided to respond in kind. The 16 men who died in the flames I set had made their choices when they decided to treat me as entertainment rather than as a person. They had created the monster that destroyed them through their own cruelty and arrogance, and they paid the ultimate price for their failure to recognize the humanity of those they oppressed. My story is a warning that echoes across the centuries. There are consequences to dehumanizing others, limits to what people will endure, and prices to be paid for systems built on cruelty and oppression. Those who forget these lessons do so at their own peril, for there will always be another Cecilia waiting in the shadows, planning her revenge, ready to prove that even the most powerless can find ways to make the powerful pay. The fire that consumed the Ashford mansion burned for only one night, but the message it sent has burned for over 300 years. Treat people as animals, and eventually they will respond as animals do when cornered and tormented beyond endurance. The only question is whether you will be wise enough to heed the warning before it is too late. While the specific details of Cecilia Leafy's story represent a fictionalized account, the historical context is accurate to colonial Virginia in 1716. Records from the period document several instances of enslaved people using fire as a weapon against their oppressors, though none on the scale described in this narrative. The systematic dehumanization of enslaved people, including forcing them to perform degrading acts for the entertainment of white audiences, is well documented in historical accounts from the period. The separation of families through sale, The denial of medical care and the casual cruelty that characterized master-slave relationships were all common features of the slavery system in colonial America. The legal proceedings described in the trial scene reflect the actual legal status of enslaved people in colonial Virginia, who had no rights and could not testify in their own defense. Public executions were common, and burning at the stake was indeed used as punishment for the most serious crimes. The psychological impact of slave resistance on white communities is well documented in historical records, which show that even minor acts of rebellion could create widespread fear and lead to increased security measures and harsher punishments. The story of Cecilia Lethe serves as a reminder of the human capacity for resistance in the face of overwhelming oppression and of the consequences that inevitably follow when societies are built on the systematic dehumanization of entire populations. The echoes of Cecilia's fire still burn in our collective memory, a reminder that oppression always contains the seeds of its own destruction, that cruelty inevitably creates the conditions for resistance, and that those who treat others as less than human do so at their own peril. Her story challenges us to examine our own capacity for both cruelty and resistance, to consider the prices we are willing to pay for justice, and to remember that even in the darkest times, even when all hope seems lost, the human spirit can find ways to fight back. If these powerful narratives of resistance and retribution move you, join our community of truth seekers. Subscribe to discover more hidden stories from America's most challenging chapters, and share your thoughts on how one woman's desperate act of vengeance became a legend that still resonates today. Your engagement helps ensure these vital stories of human dignity and the consequences of oppression continue to educate and inspire future generations.